Hi everyone, I'm April 24th. I'm going to share something that's been weighing on me for years. A story of growing up with parents who adored my brother and barely noticed me, and the decision that led to my walking away. As hard as it is to talk about, I feel it's time to get this off my chest and maybe even find some closure. I guess my earliest memories of feeling invisible go way back to when I was around 5. My brother Jake, who's 3 years older than me, was like this shining star in my family. He was lively and athletic, and honestly, he had this charm that drew people to him. I remember one of his birthdays, an epic superhero-themed party in our backyard. The whole place was done up with balloons, decorations, and even a magician. I remember thinking, as a little girl in my Wonder Woman costume, how exciting it was. But as the party went on, I started to notice something. All the attention, every single bit of it, was on Jake. I tried to show my mom a cartwheel I'd been working on, hoping she'd notice, but she barely looked before going back to fuss over Jake and his mountain of presents. I remember sitting alone, nibbling on chips by the snack table, watching everyone else cheer him on, and that's kind of how things were for the rest of my childhood. Jake became the center of our family. He was athletic, popular, and had that easygoing charisma that everyone seemed to love. My parents showed up at every one of his football games, rain or shine. They threw him big birthday parties, each year seeming to outdo the last. I, on the other hand, was quieter, more focused on school. I loved math, joined the academic clubs, and found so much joy in studying. But while Jake's games were met with applause and cheers, my achievements seemed to go by almost unnoticed. One moment I'll never forget was in 8th grade, when I competed in the state spelling bee. I spent weeks preparing for it, staying up late with my dictionary, drilling myself until I felt I could spell almost anything. I ended up winning 2nd place, a huge achievement for me. But on the day of the competition, as I stood on that stage and scanned the audience, I realized I didn't see my parents. I'd hoped they'd make it, but they were too busy at one of Jake's practices. The one person who always seemed to see me was my grandmother. She lived a few hours away, so I didn't get to see her often, but she never failed to send me handwritten letters for every accomplishment, big or small. She'd say things like, "I'm so proud of you, my little star." Her encouragement kept me going, and I'd treasure her letters, reading them whenever I felt low. When she passed away during my sophomore year of high school, it was like losing the only person who'd really seen me for who I was. High school brought even more of the same. Jake coasted through with average grades, but my parents treated him like royalty. Meanwhile, I threw myself into my studies, maintaining a 4.0 GPA, joining clubs, and even tutoring other students. Still, nothing seemed to register with my parents. Then there was this one night during my junior year. I had spent weeks working on a science fair project, pouring every spare moment into making it perfect. The night before the fair, I was in the living room finishing up when Jake came home late from a party. He was clearly drunk, stumbling around, and before I could stop him, he crashed right into my project, spilling beer all over the charts I'd worked so hard on. My parents came downstairs, and I thought for sure they'd say something to Jake. Instead, they fussed over him, asking if he was okay, while I stood there trying not to cry as my project lay ruined on the floor. When I finally let my frustration out and started to cry, my mom just sighed and told me to stop being so dramatic. I stayed up all night redoing the project and managed to salvage enough to get a 2nd place ribbon, but when I brought it home, my parents barely even looked up from the TV. They were watching one of Jake's old football games. When it came time to apply for college, Jake barely put in any effort. He seemed sure he'd get a scholarship, probably because my parents had always told him he was a star. I, on the other hand, put everything I had into my applications, especially for my dream school, a place with an incredible mathematics program. I'd wanted to go there since I was 14, when I'd attended a summer camp there. It was the first time I'd ever felt surrounded by people who shared my passion for learning. I remember thinking how amazing it would be to spend 4 years in a place like that. The day both Jake and I got our acceptance letters felt like a turning point, though not in the way I'd expected. Our parents took Jake out for a fancy dinner the night before, just to celebrate, as they put it. They didn't ask me if I wanted to come, so I spent the evening alone in my room, just trying not to let it get to me. The next morning, we all gathered in the living room as the mail arrived, and I'll never forget what happened next. I opened my letter and saw that not only had I been accepted into my dream school, but I'd also been awarded a full scholarship. I felt this rush of pride and excitement, thinking that maybe, just maybe, my parents would be proud of me too. But before I could even get a word out, Jake opened his letter, and his face fell. He'd been accepted to the local community college but hadn't received any scholarships. My parents immediately rushed to comfort him, assuring him that he was still their superstar and that it didn't matter where he went. I sat there holding my acceptance letter, feeling invisible again. When I finally managed to tell them about my scholarship, my mom gave a quick nod and my dad muttered something like, "That's nice, sweetie," before turning back to Jake. In that moment, something snapped inside me. Years of being overlooked, of feeling like I didn't matter, all came crashing down. I realized then that no matter what I did, Jake would always be their favorite, their golden child. And I knew that if I stayed, I'd always be in his shadow, never truly seen or appreciated. Without saying a word, I went upstairs and began packing. I threw clothes, essentials, and my laptop into a bag. As I was about to leave, I grabbed a framed photo of my grandmother from my nightstand, carefully wrapping it in a sweater before slipping it into my bag. Then, without looking back, I walked out the door and headed to my best friend Sarah's house. I texted her, asking if I could crash for a few days, and I blocked my family's numbers. It's been 3 days now. I'm at Sarah's place, and her family has been more understanding and supportive than I ever expected. They've even said I can stay with them until I head off to college in the fall. Yesterday, I finally checked my email and there were dozens of messages from my parents, some angry, some pleading. They want to know what they did wrong and why I left. But I don't feel ready to answer. All I can think about is the years I spent trying to be enough for them, only to be invisible next to Jake. It's been 6 months since I left my parents' house, and it feels like I've stepped into an entirely different life. Moving out was the hardest, most painful decision I've ever made, but these past months have brought me more freedom and peace than I ever thought possible. Since I left, I've thrown myself into my studies, living in my dorm on campus, and finally experiencing what it's like to live without constantly feeling like I'm second place. My roommate Lily and I bonded almost immediately. She's kind and easy to talk to, and it's been refreshing having someone who just sees me. We've become fast friends, and on nights we're not studying, we'll sit up, talking about everything from classes to our future plans. It wasn't easy at first. I remember the feeling of sitting in my dorm room that first night, my suitcase half unpacked, the unfamiliar sounds of campus life filling the silence. It was surreal, and for a split second I considered calling my parents, telling them everything, and begging them to understand why I left. But I reminded myself of why I walked away, of every moment I felt unseen or ignored. I pushed through, and gradually that empty feeling turned into something else. Peace, maybe? It was the first time I'd felt like I could breathe in a long time. With Lily's encouragement, I joined a study group for my calculus class, which has been more rewarding than I expected. There's Tom, a pre-med student who stress bakes cookies during finals week. Alice, a physics major with a quirky sense of humor. And Maria, an art history major who helps us keep things in perspective when we get too buried in numbers and equations. They've become my new support system, filling a space I didn't realize I had. It's incredible, really, to be part of a group that celebrates your victories and genuinely cares about your struggles. I've also picked up a job as a teaching assistant in the mathematics department to help cover living expenses. It's a demanding role with hours of grading papers and answering students' questions, but it's rewarding. I work under Dr. Hughes, who reminds me a bit of my grandmother. She's kind and encouraging and has this way of making people feel like they're worth her time. She's quickly become something of a mentor to me, guiding me through my role and even helping me adjust to the independence I'm still learning to embrace. One of the best parts of working in the department has been meeting Mark, another teaching assistant. Our connection was instant, though it started with the usual late nights grading assignments and prepping lesson plans. There was one night, close to midnight, when I was exhausted and questioning if I could handle everything on my plate. Mark noticed and slipped away, only to come back with a cup of my favorite coffee and a chocolate muffin. That small act of kindness struck me harder than I expected. He's smart, gentle, and genuinely cares about people. And for the first time, I'm seeing what a relationship based on mutual respect and appreciation could look like. Our friendship quickly grew into something more, and having someone in my life who truly supports me has been a revelation. Mark celebrates my successes as if they're his own, notices when I'm struggling, and always knows just how to lift me up. For the first time, I'm beginning to see myself through the eyes of someone who values me, and it feels transformative. As I've started to settle into this new life, my parents have occasionally reached out. At first, I'd get strings of messages from my mom, demanding to know where I was and why I left. Her texts varied between guilt-tripping me and attempts to reason with me, each one hitting me with a pang of guilt. My dad even sent a curt email asking when I'd stop this nonsense and come home. But each time I thought about responding, I'd remember the countless times I'd sought their attention only to be met with indifference. With each message I didn't reply to, I felt a little stronger, a little more sure of my decision. Holidays have been the hardest. Thanksgiving came and went, and though Lily invited me to her family's dinner, I felt a twinge of sadness I couldn't quite shake. Her family welcomed me with open arms, and they were lovely, but it's hard not to feel like an outsider when everyone around you has that family connection you don't. Christmas was tougher. Most of my classmates left campus for the holidays, and I found myself one of the few still here. I spent Christmas Eve with a few other students who hadn't gone home, and we cooked a meal together in the shared kitchen. As different as it was, it felt nice, even comforting in a way, to share a holiday with people who understood what it was like to be without family. Despite the difficulties, I know leaving was the right decision. Every day, I'm growing more independent, finding my rhythm, and discovering that I'm capable of so much more than I realized. Even as the loneliness hits sometimes, I know that I'm on the right path. I'm choosing to build a life for myself, one where I'm valued for who I am and where I'm not overshadowed by someone else's expectations. Looking forward, I feel a cautious excitement. Dr. Hughes encouraged me to apply for a summer research program in mathematics, a prestigious one I'd never have considered on my own. The application process is intense, but Mark and my friends have rallied around me, helping me polish my application and cheering me on. This kind of support is new to me, and every day I'm grateful for these people who see my worth and encourage me to reach for more. Mark and I have started to talk about our future in quiet, hopeful tones. It's early, and we're both still so focused on our studies and careers, but there's a sense of promise in our relationship. The thought of building a life with someone who genuinely values me and who respects my ambitions and dreams is both thrilling and humbling. The challenges aren't over. I'm still learning to balance the demands of school, my teaching assistant role, and my relationships, all while handling finances on my own. It's a juggling act, to say the least, and there are days I miss the comfort of a stable family and the idea of a home to go back to. But I know that I've made the right choice for myself. I'm no longer the invisible girl, overlooked and underestimated. I'm building my own life, and I'm slowly but surely becoming the person I've always wanted to be. 2 years have passed since I walked out of my parents' house and stepped into a life of my own making. It feels surreal, looking back. In those years, I transformed in ways I couldn't have imagined, and even though some days are still a challenge, I finally feel grounded. Last month, I graduated from university, summa cum laude. As I stood on that stage, hearing my name called and feeling the weight of my diploma in my hands, I was overwhelmed by a wave of pride. My professors, friends, and of course Mark were all there, cheering me on. It was a bittersweet moment. I couldn't help but imagine my grandmother in the audience, her kind eyes shining with pride. Even though she's not here, I carry her support in my heart. And in that moment, I knew she would have been proud. The road to graduation wasn't without its rough patches. There were many nights I questioned my choices, doubting if I could manage the demands of my academic load and my responsibilities. During one semester, I took an advanced topology class that nearly broke me. I spent hours trying to wrap my mind around the concepts, frustrated that I just couldn't get it. But my support system, my study group, Mark, and my mentors never let me give up. They encouraged me, reminding me that I was more than capable. When I finally aced that final exam, it felt like a victory for all of us, a testament to the strength we'd built together. In the midst of this journey, my relationship with Mark deepened. We became each other's anchors, supporting one another through the highs and lows of university life. On graduation day, after the ceremony, Mark surprised me. He took me to our favorite spot in the campus botanical gardens, the same place where he'd first told me he loved me. In that quiet, familiar setting, he proposed. It was simple, heartfelt, and perfect. I said yes, feeling a sense of completeness that I'd never known before. Last week, we got married in a small, intimate ceremony. Our friends, professors, and a handful of people who had become my makeshift family were there. As I stood in my dress, surrounded by the people who had supported me, I felt a pang of sadness. I thought about how different it could have been if things had been better with my family. I imagined my mother there, helping me get ready, and my father walking me down the aisle. But the sadness didn't linger. I was surrounded by love, and I knew that family wasn't always about blood. It was about the people who showed up for you, who truly saw you. And here I was, starting a new chapter with a partner who understood and valued me in a way I'd once thought impossible. Mark and I are both excited about the future. We've decided to move to a new city, 3 hours away, where I've accepted a position as a high school math teacher. Teaching wasn't on my radar initially, but as I worked with students and tutored them, I found a joy in it. I realized I wanted to be there for young people who might feel unseen, just like I once did. Mark found a job in engineering nearby, and we're ready to start this new chapter together, full of hope. We were actually in the middle of packing for our honeymoon when everything changed. Our suitcases were sprawled across the bed, and Mark was debating whether he really needed to pack that extra pair of shoes. We were laughing, enjoying the simplicity of the moment when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and neither was Mark, so I opened the door, curious. Standing there were my parents. I hadn't seen them in over 2 years, and they looked different, worn down and tired. My mother's face was puffy, as though she'd been crying, and my father had an air of defeat that made him look older. I was caught off guard, frozen as they asked if they could come inside. I hesitated, but finally stepped aside, letting them in. We sat in the living room, the air thick with tension and words unspoken. After a moment of awkward silence, they began to talk, spilling a story that hit me harder than I'd expected. Jake, my golden child brother, had fallen in love with a woman my parents described as manipulative and greedy. Against their wishes, he had married her 6 months ago, and everything had changed. Jake, once the pride of our family, had started distancing himself from our parents. Apparently, he had been demanding money, making veiled threats to cut them out of his life if they didn't comply. Things escalated until last week, Jake convinced my father to sign over the deed to our family home to him. Once he had it in his name, he promptly evicted my parents, leaving them homeless and with little more than a suitcase each. As I listened, I felt a mix of emotions. Part of me felt a grim sense of satisfaction, a feeling I wasn't proud of. After all the years they'd put Jake on a pedestal and ignored me, their golden child had turned on them. But another part of me felt pity, seeing them so broken. It was like they'd finally woken up to the consequences of their choices, and I was sitting there, bearing witness. When they finished, my mother reached for my hand, her eyes pleading. "We're so sorry," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "We realize now how wrong we were. We know we took you for granted. Could we stay here for a while, just until we get back on our feet?" I looked down at her hand reaching for mine, and suddenly years of frustration and heartbreak surfaced. I could feel the weight of all those times I was ignored. All those moments I'd tried to make them proud but was met with indifference. They were here now, asking for help. Not because they'd realized their mistakes on their own, but because they had nowhere else to go. Taking a deep breath, I pulled my hand back and steadied myself. "No," I said, my voice calm but resolute. "You can't stay here, Dot." Their expressions shifted from shock to hurt, and my father's voice wavered as he asked why I was turning them away. I took a moment to gather my thoughts, wanting to make sure they understood. "Dot, For years, I tried to earn your love and approval, I began, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I was finally able to say. I worked so hard to be good enough to be seen by you. But it was never enough, was it? No matter what I did, Jake was always the one who mattered. And now, after all this time, you're here because Jake turned his back on you. My mother started to protest, but I held up my hand, stopping her. I've spent the past 2 years building a life for myself. A life where I'm valued and where people care about me. I won't go back to being the invisible daughter who only matters when you need something from her. There was a long pause, and then I continued, my voice softer. I'm sorry for what Jake did to you. I really am. But I can't be the solution to your problems. You made your choices long ago. Now you have to live with the consequences. I stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. They lingered, their faces etched with desperation, but I couldn't bring myself to let them in. They had pushed me aside too many times, and I had finally learned to protect myself. With a final nod, I led them to the door, saying, "Please don't come back." As I closed the door, tears began to fill my eyes, and I leaned against it, letting the emotions wash over me. Mark came over, pulling me into his arms, letting me cry. He didn't say anything, he just held me, his presence steady and comforting. After a few minutes, I wiped my eyes and looked around our half-packed room, realizing that I was truly closing a chapter of my life. Tomorrow, Mark and I will leave for our honeymoon. We'd explore new places, make new memories, and continue building our life together. A life built on mutual respect and unconditional support. And while a part of me would always mourn the family relationship I never had, I knew that I was finally free. I was choosing to focus on the life I was creating, a life where I was seen, heard, and loved for exactly who I was. As I finished packing my suitcase, I glanced at the framed photo of my grandmother on the dresser. Her eyes seemed to shine with pride, and I felt a calm settle within me, like a soft whisper reminding me, "You did the right thing." Months have passed since my parents showed up on my doorstep, and life has moved forward in ways I never thought possible. Mark and I have settled into our new city, our new apartment, and our new routines. It feels good, steady, and full of promise. I have a career I'm passionate about, a home filled with warmth, and people around me who genuinely care. Teaching math at the high school level has been more rewarding than I imagined. When I see my students' faces light up as they grasp new concepts, I can't help but think of my own struggles to be recognized, my efforts that went unseen for so long. These kids remind me of myself in so many ways, and I'm determined to be there for them in ways I needed at their age. I've even started an after-school tutoring club for students who want extra help, and it's become a sanctuary, a place where they know they'll be heard and supported. And then there's Mark. Every day with him reaffirms what I once doubted, that I am lovable, that I am worthy, that there is someone who sees me as I am and loves me without conditions. He's been patient and understanding as I've worked through the aftermath of my family's reappearance, and in him, I find stability. We've talked about our future, about having kids someday, about building a life that's filled with the kind of love and support I always wanted, but didn't know how to find until now. For a while, I kept my parents out of my mind, choosing not to reach out or engage. I needed that distance to breathe and to see clearly how their influence had shaped me. But their visit left a mark that I couldn't just ignore. I started seeing a therapist again to unpack everything I'd buried over the years, especially the complex feelings that came up after I turned them away. Some days, I felt guilty for not giving them another chance. But then, I'd remember the years of hurt, the long nights I'd spent feeling invisible, and I'd remind myself that setting boundaries was the healthiest choice I could make. Over time, therapy helped me understand that while my parents' neglect was painful, it wasn't a reflection of my worth. They had their own issues, their own blind spots, and I was merely caught in the crossfire. As I healed, I realized that forgiveness didn't mean letting them back into my life. It meant letting go of the hope that they'd someday be the parents I needed. By forgiving them in my own way, I was freeing myself from the weight of unmet expectations. This past winter, I received a letter from my mother. She wrote about how things had gotten worse with Jake, how he distanced himself even further, and how he and his wife had taken control of nearly all their assets. My mother's words were laced with regret, guilt, and a desperation that almost pulled at my heart. Almost. She asked if I'd reconsider letting them back into my life, even going so far as to suggest that we could all move in together to start over. I sat with the letter for days, reading it and rereading it. Her regret was apparent, but so was her belief that I could be the one to save them. That was when it struck me. They hadn't truly changed. My parents were sorry for how things turned out, but they weren't sorry for how they treated me all those years. They missed the security I could provide more than they missed me as a person. I never responded to that letter. Instead, I kept focusing on my life, my marriage, and my healing. I put the letter away in a box with a few other reminders of my family. Mementos I decided to keep, not out of sentiment, but as reminders of how far I'd come. Those items represented a past that had shaped me, yes, but also a past I had chosen to leave behind. Spring arrived with a sense of renewal, and Mark and I spent weekends exploring nearby parks and hiking trails, savoring our newfound stability. In those quiet moments, surrounded by nature, I felt grounded in a way I hadn't since childhood. Each hike, each conversation, and each shared laugh became a new memory, one I could cherish without pain. Life felt lighter, more hopeful, like the first day of sunshine after a long, bleak winter. Then, one sunny Saturday morning, as I was clearing out our closet, I came across the photo of my grandmother I'd kept since I left home. Her warm smile and gentle eyes reminded me of a time when I felt unconditionally loved, of someone who had seen my worth long before anyone else did. I decided to put her photo on my desk at work, a small tribute to the woman who had been my true family. Every time I see her picture now, I'm reminded of the resilience she inspired in me, the strength to create a life that honors who I am. At work, I'm thriving. I was recently asked to lead a mentorship program for struggling students, which has become my passion project. In those students, I see echoes of my younger self, the quiet ones, the ones who think no one notices them. I see it as my mission to remind them that they're seen and that their efforts matter. Just last week, one of my students, a girl who'd been struggling all year, brought me a hand-drawn card that read, "Thank you for believing in me." It was a small gesture, but in that moment, I felt like everything I'd been through had led me here. As for my relationship with Mark, we've never been stronger. We're planning a trip for our first anniversary, a small celebration of the love and commitment we've built together. Sometimes when we're lying in bed talking about our future, I catch myself marveling at the life I've found. It's not perfect, but it's real, and it's mine. I no longer feel like I'm chasing anyone's approval. Instead, I'm building a life based on my own values and my own dreams. Recently, I spoke to my therapist about closure. I told her that while I still occasionally wonder if I should have given my parents a chance to reconcile, I don't regret the decision I made. She smiled and said something that stuck with me. Closure isn't about tying everything up neatly. Sometimes it's about accepting that things won't be what you wanted and finding peace with that. Her words reminded me that my journey isn't about fixing the past. It's about creating a future that honors the person I've become. In moments of quiet reflection, I think about what I would say if I ever crossed paths with my parents again. Maybe one day I'd tell them that despite everything, I've found peace. That I don't hate them, but I don't need them either. They taught me hard lessons, ones I never wanted, but ones that led me here to a life filled with genuine love, respect, and fulfillment. As I close this chapter, I feel a sense of contentment I didn't know was possible. My story may not have had a fairy tale family ending, but I've found my own kind of happiness. I'm no longer the girl who felt invisible, nor am I haunted by the need to prove my worth to people who couldn't see it. I've carved out a life where I am fully seen and fully loved, and that's enough. For anyone out there reading this who feels overlooked or unappreciated, know that you're not alone. Healing takes time, and sometimes it means walking away from people you once thought you couldn't live without. But on the other side of that pain, there's a life waiting, a life where you are celebrated, loved, and valued just as you are. Hold on to that vision and keep moving forward. You are worthy and you are enough.